Charlie leaned against the deck rail of the chartered riverboat as it steamed slowly up the Nile en route to Abydos. It was evening. He marveled once again as the sky slowly darkened to the velvet tones he had seen the night before. The stars began to take their place on the cloudless stage, 1,000 brilliant jewel facets glowing brightly. He wondered absently how many of them might be circled by one, two, several planets, and how many of those planets could possibly right now contain beings going about their daily lives, perhaps even staring up at their own star-hung heavens themselves. His thoughts wandered to home and his beautiful Victoria. "Good evening," Rosie's voice said as she came up quietly beside him, leaning her elbows on the railing and staring upwards also. She turned her head and gave him a serious look. "You seemed so far away." He shrugged and dismissed the thought. "I was thinking of the notebook." He lied, and he patted his rucksack as he spoke, reassuring himself as to the notebook's presence. His movement revealed another shape in the bag, and Rosie's eyes widened. "Charlie, is that a gun?" Somewhat sheepishly, he nodded and extracted the Webley to show her. "I thought it would be a good idea to have it along." Rosie looked dubious. Charlie had shown admirable physical prowess, but she wasn't sure that he would be as comfortable with a revolver as he was with his fists. "Have you ever fired a gun?" she asked. "No, never." There was a short silence, then he said quickly, "But I will if I need to, if we're in danger, Rosie." Carefully, he reinserted the Webley in his satchel and took her in his arms. "No one knows that I have it, not even Max. So please promise me that you won't tell anyone." He shook his head in response to her anxious expression. "I'm serious, Rosie. I don't want to take any chances. I'm starting to learn a little about the evils in the world and don't want anything to happen to us." Rosie shivered, and Charlie pulled her closer to him. "I thought that fellow in the hut was going to hurt you. Or worse," he said intensely, gazing into her eyes, once again realizing how deep and soft a brown they were. "Max tells me that you have a girl back home," asked Rosie. "We're sort of separated," said Charlie hesitantly. She pulled closer towards him, and Charlie spoke again, changing the subject. "I have a present for you." He pulled a small packet out of his pocket and unwrapped it, holding it up in the light so she could see. It was a small heart scarab hung on a chain. He had purchased it in Cairo with vague thoughts at the time of his fiancée, but now it seemed that it suited Rosie eminently. Rosie examined the inscription, reading under her breath, then gave Charlie a look which made his toes curl. "Do you know what this says, Charlie?" she asked. He flushed. "Well," he said awkwardly, "the merchant said something about a love spell." "It is," she said quickly. "It's a good luck charm and love token. The spell on the amulet is supposed to prevent your heart from betraying you." The fathomless brown gaze captured him again, and Charlie started to slowly pull her closer again. "Is your heart betraying you now?" he asked softly, dangerously, keeping his eyes locked on hers. With a tiny smile, her head tilted up slightly for her lips to meet his, for a long, slow, sweet kiss. She broke it off first, giving him a larger smile, and his mouth descended on hers again, tasting what she offered while the world around them seemed to pause in its journeying. Moving instinctively, they retreated from the railing to one of the benches that ran along the deck, surrendering to another lengthy kiss. Then Rosie cuddled up against him. He chuckled to himself and shifted his arm slightly to give her more support as he leaned back against the rear of the bench, settling down to watch the river and the night sky once more. A star shooting overhead briefly illuminated the carving on Rosie's amulet, and, for some perverse reason, Charlie found himself pulling out the locket that Victoria had given him. He thumbed it open and stared at the picture. Perhaps it was merely the light, but it looked like her eyes were staring at him gravely. He missed her. Disconcerted, he shifted his gaze to the riverbank passing by and was startled to see a heron, which had paused in dipping its beak to stare directly at the passing steamer and, it seemed, at Charlie himself. Its regard reminded him of his grandfather's face. A doubt crossed his mind. The heron abruptly opened its wings and took flight. "Am I doing the right thing?" he asked himself once again, but the night gave him no answer. After 3 days of river travel, passing more palms and rushes, occasional small villages, and the odd fortified town on either side of the Nile, they reached the Libyan foothills, where they were to disembark for their journey to Abydos by camel. It had been a quiet journey for the most part. Charlie had continued to spend time in Rosie's company and frequently found the opportunity to enjoy more of her kisses. It was clear that Rosie was more affectionate than Victoria, and her long, passionate kisses made Charlie weak at the knees. Of course, he would have liked more of her attention, but, in the confined areas of the ship, he contented himself with walks and numerous animated discussions on a variety of diverse subjects. Max made his appearance at intervals, subsequently disappearing to indulge in whatever activities or proclivities he was pursuing. Max didn't offer any details, and Charlie didn't ask. On the morning of the third day, Max wandered onto the starboard deck where the breakfast table had been set up for the travelers, who were enjoying cups of strong tea and stronger Egyptian coffee. "The captain has informed me that we can expect to disembark at approximately noon," he remarked, helping himself to tea. "The supplies are ready, and I've telegraphed ahead for camels." "I'd better go and make sure my father's all ready," Rosie said. "He's not always as organized as he likes to think." Turning to pass Max, she gave him a quick, saucy pat on the arm. "I'll see you both real soon," she said pertly, and went laughing on her way. Both men watched her go, the identical thought in their minds. Surprisingly, Max put it into words as they made their way along the deck to begin the disembarkation process. "That one's trouble, no doubt about it." After disembarkation from the river steamer, they collected their supplies together and started to load up the camels for the 7-mile journey to the dig site. Abydos, or Abdu, as it was known to the ancient Egyptians, is about 90 miles north of Luxor, and in ancient times was the chief seat of worship of Osiris, lord of the underworld. It was inextricably linked with Saqqara as a place of burial for the early dynastic kings. Despite being an important archaeological site, it was not a popular stopping-off point for the many tourists who traveled the Nile area, most of them preferring to visit the temples at Luxor, and very few of them ever venturing here. The local villagers, unused to seeing tourists this far off the beaten track, crowded them, shouting for bakshish as the small party of adventurers tried in vain to organize their equipment. Despite being told by Max not to do so, Charlie handed out a few coins, only to be swamped by hundreds of children, as the word quickly circulated that money was being distributed. If not for the timely intervention of Max, they would have been completely mobbed, the big man shouting loudly and waving his hands wildly to disperse the assembled throng. Eventually, they got themselves organized, and a few hours later, after an uneventful camel ride to Abydos, they arrived at Petrie's camp. They were met by a middle-aged gentleman with a magnificent white beard who was waiting for them at the edge of the excavation site. Chatsworth hobbled up to shake the stranger's hand and then turned to introduce him to the assembled group. "Charlie, this is Flinders Petrie, probably the most renowned Egyptologist in the world." Petrie smiled diffidently. "Oh, I don't know that I would put it quite that way, Moses. I'm just a hard-working scientist, that's all." Charlie had spent some time with Chatsworth on the steamer, talking about their host and his achievements, so he was well aware that Petrie was being excessively modest. William Matthew Flinders Petrie, FRS, was the foremost Egyptologist of his day, in England or anywhere else in Europe, and had gained the respect of the entire scientific and academic world. Now aged 51, he had excavated at most of the important archaeological sites in Egypt, beginning with a survey of the Great Pyramid of Giza in 1880. He had first begun working at Abydos in 1899 and was in the process of excavating several of the individual structures at the site. Charlie smiled back, shaking Petrie's hand and tendering him Maspero's note. "I'm sure that's an understatement, sir. Mr. Maspero informed me that he holds you in very high regard." Petrie scanned the note, eyebrows raised, occasionally glancing at the innocuous young man standing before him. "Maspero mentions a secret sanctuary that you have found?" Charlie nodded and motioned to two of the camp chairs. "If I may, sir, I'd like to tell you the details." "Certainly," Petrie agreed. After arranging for refreshments for the newcomers, he collected a tall glass of water with lemon slices floating in it for himself and sat down, waiting. Charlie made one or two false starts as he gathered his thoughts, then related the whole story of his adventures thus far, starting with his discovery of the riddle at Wilton Hall. "So," he finished, offering the notebook to Petrie, "it appears that Abydos is where we should find the Tomb of Destiny." Petrie had listened calmly, although the bushy eyebrows had ascended a few more times during the telling. Now he mused over the lines in the notebook, then nodded. "I believe you may be correct, Charlie. Your theory about a secret sanctuary containing pharaohs is a view held by many respected archaeologists. I have been excavating here for years, and based on what you have told me, I think I know where your entrance may be located. Come with me, I'll show you." He pushed himself up out of the chair, and Charlie followed suit to fall into step beside the archaeologist as he set off. They walked a short distance to one of the digs. Petrie waved a hand at it as they paused. "This is the temple of Seti IV, which we believe was built around the end of his reign, approximately 1300 BC. He was a New Kingdom pharaoh, and his temple contains two lists on its walls. One is a list of the 120 gods of ancient Egypt, and the other is what we call the Abydos King list." Continuing along, he added, "However, there is another, much older temple that we found over here and that we are currently excavating. It was a smaller structure, built on a considerably lower level than the larger temple, and even to Charlie's untutored eye, the architectural style seemed markedly different." Petrie confirmed his impression. "This is the Osirian, or the Temple of Osiris, the Egyptian god of the underworld. It's an interesting temple, but doesn't seem to fit in with its surroundings. For instance, the use of the enormous 100-ton granite columns and lintels is not in the same architectural style as Seti's temple at all, but instead, it is more like the pyramid temples of the Old Kingdom." He pointed out several of the pieces to illustrate his point. "In fact, Mr. Waterman, I believe that it predates the Seti temple, and quite likely dates back to the Old Kingdom and the reign of Zoser." Charlie nodded excitedly. "That would tie in with the idea that it was built by Imhotep." Petrie smiled, pleased by Charlie's astuteness. "My thinking exactly." He started to walk along the dig site. "And here's another odd thing. We have had great difficulty excavating here. As we dig the sand out, it fills up with water. It would appear that the temple is under the water table." Charlie looked puzzled. "But, based on the length of our trip by camel, I would imagine we're several miles inland from the river, aren't we?" "Exactly," Petrie agreed. "In ancient times there was a canal that came here from the river Nile, which the Egyptians used to transport items, so we know that there was water at this site. However, this is a very odd place to build a temple, at such a low a level, unless, that is, you wanted to fill it with water in the first place." Charlie was silent, mulling over the archaeologist's words and wondering what their implications might be. Petrie motioned him over to the side of the enclosure, where a long passage beckoned, its walls decorated with a multitude of painted characters. "This is the north entrance passage, Charlie. Look at the walls and tell me what you see." Charlie shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand hieroglyphs." Petrie looked surprised, and Charlie explained, "Rosie has deciphered them thus far." I see, Petrie replied. Well, Charlie, the hieroglyphs here portray the Book of the Gates and the Book of Caverns, which are all guides to the underworld. However, Rosie tells me that the stela at Saqqara talks of the Amduat, or that which is in the afterworld. The Amduat is an ancient text describing the journey of the sun god through the underworld. It is a collection of divine wisdom reserved for kings and high priests. It describes the journey of the deceased king. The text of the Amduat can be interpreted in many ways, but basically it is a 4,000-year-old guidebook telling us how to make our way through the underworld. Archaeologists have believed that the journey was simply a representative one, mostly symbolic and for religious purposes. But if your Tomb of Destiny really exists, then these chants could be real instructions describing the way through real underground chambers. Back at the camp, Petrie called out to his team of helpers, and small parties of students came running across from their various locations around the site. Forming themselves into orderly groups around the archaeologist, the chattering students gradually settled down to listen as the great man started to speak. His short lecture, delivered with considerable professionalism, quickly related the salient parts of the story so far, to the delight of the assembled crowd. Midway through the presentation, Rosie was asked to do her bit, and she read out the translation from the stela at Saqqara and the meanings of the sacred symbols. Chatsworth stood to one side beaming proudly as Rosie delivered her piece. When all present had been fully briefed, Petrie split them up into several smaller groups and, in true scientific tradition, designated each group a specific search area. Chatsworth and Max paired off and took one part of the temple complex, leaving Charlie and Rosie searching another portion. Petrie and his team examined the opposite end of the structure, all looking for the sacred symbols. The temple itself was quite unlike anything that Charlie had ever seen before. Although he had only been in Egypt a few short days, Rosie and her father had given him a good grounding in the subject of Egyptology, and he was slowly becoming an expert in these matters. He noticed that huge pillars of red Aswan granite, some of which supported equally massive architraves and formed the main structure of the temple. In the center of the temple could be seen a raised platform, surrounded by a trench filled with water, with steps leading down at two ends. The outer walls of the temple, built of red sandstone, contained chambers which led off in all directions, probably designed as receptacles for statues or other religious artifacts. This was truly an amazing place, and a shiver of excitement ran up his spine as he realized that this temple held the secret that he had craved for so long. After 4 hours of searching, it was Chatsworth who let out the triumphant shout. "Here they are, all three, the circle, the triangle, and the square!" Everyone descended on the center of the temple, where Chatsworth was pointing to the carvings in the wall of the large pit, approximately 20 square feet in size. Stone steps descended down into the pit on 2 of the 4 sides. Rosie remembered a passage from the Amduat. "May a stairway to the Duat be set up for you to the place where Orion is." Charlie held up his notebook at the proper page, and it was clear that the symbols matched. He felt the heady thrill of exhilaration, which left as quickly as it had arrived, as they realized that the pit was full of dark green, murky water through which nothing could be discerned. He looked up to meet Rosie's horrified eyes. "It's under the water," she said unhappily. "Professor Johnson's translation from the notebook said, 'under the water.' How are we supposed to get down there?" Her father shook his head. "Don't ask me. I can't swim." Max started to open his mouth, but Charlie beat him to the punch. "I'll do it. I was best in my class in diving and swimming." He shook his head firmly as the bodyguard started to protest. "No, Max, let me. I can't let you do everything on this trip. Besides, I need you to hold onto the rope and haul me up if I run into any difficulties. You're much stronger than I am." Max gave Charlie a wry smile of admiration as he reluctantly agreed to let him have a go. Charlie quickly stripped down to his underwear, to the obvious delight of Rosie, and then dropped carefully into the slime as Max slowly paid out the rope, watching Charlie descend into the unattractive basin. Rosie leaned over the side. "Be careful, Charlie." Charlie looked up and grinned at her, hoping she couldn't see his teeth chattering. Despite the heat of the afternoon, the grimy water was quite cold. "Don't worry, I'll be back in no time," he said insouciantly, and dived down before he could change his mind. The murkiness of the water was even worse below the waterline. He was floating in a deep, gray-green sump so thick that he could barely see his own hand. The thought of touching the walls was unappealing at best, but if he was going to locate the entrance, assuming they were correct in the first place, he was going to have to use the touch-and-feel method. He reached out gingerly and moved forward until his outstretched hands met something hard, cold, and indubitably slimy. Charlie took a firm grip on his stomach and his imagination, trying very hard not to think about the etiology of the gunk on the walls, and began to move along down and to his left. Charlie surfaced repeatedly to refresh the air in his lungs, and then dived back down again, under the green slime, each time exploring a new part of the sump. The slimy walls gave no hint as to a way in, and, after an hour or so, Charlie was beginning to think that they had misunderstood the symbols, and he was diving in the wrong place. From the sides of the pit, his companions were shouting words of encouragement, but Charlie was starting to feel the cold. Max shouted down that he should take over, but this only stirred Charlie on to continue. With once last concerted effort, Charlie made the decision to dive even deeper on the off chance that the entrance was at the very bottom of the pit. Charlie kicked out and thrust his arms and legs purposefully as he forced himself to descend further down into the depths of the slime. His lungs were bursting and aching as he frantically searched for the underwater entrance in the darkness. Just when he thought he could stand no more, his hands touched an obvious lintel in the side wall of the chamber, and as Charlie swam under and into a tunnel, he realized that he had found the way in. With a last-minute rush of adrenaline, he made the decision to continue into the tunnel, not knowing how long it was or how long his breath would hold. Fortunately for Charlie, his lungs did hold out, and the tunnel turned out to be only about 10 feet long, so he was able to surface quite quickly in a large chamber, only part of which appeared to be underwater. Catching his breath and spitting out water and coughing violently, Charlie looked quickly around this dark and dank place. It smelled awful. The smell was the scent of thousands of years, the trapped odors of decay and age. His eyes slowly becoming accustomed to the very dim light that reflected up under the tunnel entrance. Only the priests would have known where this chamber was located, he thought, marveling at the ingenuity of Imhotep. He yanked on the rope to let Max know he was returning, and launched himself back down into the tunnel, making his way carefully back along the passage, eventually shooting upwards with a triumphant grin. "I found it! I found the entrance to the sanctuary!" Charlie's companions heaved him out of the water and onto the side, whereupon Rosie quickly wrapped him in a warm towel that she had brought from her tent. Charlie was shaking and aching from the exertion of the last hour, and as he sat down, a wave of nausea swept over him, causing him to retch and vomit in front of his friends. "You poor thing," said Rosie, rubbing him with the towel to keep him warm. "You've overexerted yourself. Why didn't you let Max go down there?" Charlie looked across at Max, who was nodding his head slowly in agreement. "She's right, Charlie. You should have let me do it. But it doesn't matter now. The job is done, and we have our way in. I couldn't have done it any better myself." He came over to Charlie and patted him on the back, his hand squeezing his shoulder and lingering for a moment. Then he winked at him and gave him a smile. This small gesture spoke millions to Charlie. "I'd be glad to have you on my team any time," added Max. Charlie beamed at this unexpected compliment from the old soldier, and for the first time in his life, he felt really proud about himself. He hadn't had much praise from his own father, and this from Max felt good. Considering the awful experiences that Max had endured in the war, Charlie was honored to be thought of as one of the team. The small group retired back to the camp and settled down to discuss what they had found. Charlie sat and drew a diagram in the sand for the others. The entrance is about 20 feet down, and then a channel runs for a further 10 feet underwater, coming up in a large chamber. "Is that underwater also?" asked Chatsworth unhappily, not looking forward to the prospect of swimming. Charlie was oblivious to the worried tone. "No, sir," he replied. "There is a channel, like a canal, that goes through it, but there is a proper stone floor, but we'll need to swim under the gate and into the chamber holding our breaths." Max grunted. "We'll have to figure a way to get the boat in." Petrie smiled. "I suggest you have a chat with some of my students here. They're quite inventive, and they've had considerable experience working with ropes and pulleys." Max nodded, then he wandered off to sort out the boat. Charlie leaned back in his chair, enjoying the warmth from the campfire, and listened idly as Petrie explained the Amduat to Rosie in more detail. Handing her a notebook of his own, the archaeologist explained, "These are translations of the Amduat and of the Book of Gates, which will help you navigate the underworld." He pointed to one of the pages. "The journey is divided into 12 hours, each of which is divided from the next by great gates, guarded by sentries known as the dwellers on the threshold. The deceased must address each one by name, for the names are themselves keys to the gates. You will need to enter at nightfall. It will take 12 hours to navigate the chambers, and you should arrive at the Tomb of Destiny at dawn, having completed the journey." "Thank you, Professor," Rosie said seriously, tucking his notebook away carefully. "I'll keep this safe for you." After a few minutes of silence, Rosie joined her father where he stood checking their equipment, leaving Charlie sitting alone with the great archaeologist. Charlie couldn't help but think that Petrie would be an invaluable addition to the expedition. "Won't you come with us, Professor?" he invited. "You'd be a great help getting through the underworld chambers." Petrie smiled. "I'd love to come with you, but I've got my hands full right here, Charlie, and you'd benefit more from someone younger than I. Anyway, I've had my fair share of adventures, I think." "What do you mean?" Charlie asked curiously. Petrie fished a pipe out of a pocket and began preparing it. "I've been researching ancient Egypt and Palestine for many years, Charlie. I've spent a lifetime measuring and recording pyramids and temples. It's all been a great adventure ever since I first began surveying English prehistoric monuments as a young man. I don't think I've ever stopped working. But this could be the most exciting find the world has ever known," Charlie objected. "And you're certainly no older than Mr. Chatsworth." Petrie glanced up from the tobacco he was tamping into his pipe bowl, smiling at Charlie's youthful enthusiasm. "Can I give you some advice, Charlie?" he asked suddenly. "By all means," Charlie replied, puzzled. "Have you ever owned a dog?" Charlie looked even more confused. "A dog?" Petrie nodded. "I had once had a dog, a Labrador called Blackie. As a puppy, he was so active, running around all the time and chasing his own tail. He was great fun." The pipe successfully lit. He put it to his lips and enjoyed a puff or two before continuing. The world was an exciting place for that dog. Every day brought him a new adventure. For 14 years he enjoyed the world. As he became old, even though he was still a lovely animal, his needs changed. He wanted to lie in front of the fire a lot and sleep for most of the day. He became lazy. Do you know what I'm trying to tell you, Charlie? "I think so," Charlie replied, but he still looked doubtful. Petrie tossed some more wood on the fire. "When we're young, Charlie, we are all enthusiastic, but as we get older, we get a bit wiser and realize that many things in life are not quite as important anymore. Running around all the time is not a long-term occupation. As we get older, our priorities change, and we like to take life a bit easier. Contentment becomes more important to us. Do Do you understand what I mean?" With a grin, he said, "I'm rather like that dog now, Charlie. Sitting by the fire is more attractive to me now that I'm older." "Are you saying I'm wasting my time?" Charlie asked anxiously. Petrie shook his head. "No, Charlie, not at all. Nothing is a waste of time if it makes you happy. After all, that's the only thing that makes life worthwhile, being happy. Just keep things in perspective. That's all I'm saying. You'll find that, in the whole scheme of things, nothing is that important compared with happiness." He gestured around at the sight. "I've been very fortunate that I was able to do just what I wanted in my life. Digging around in the desert isn't everyone's idea of a good time, but I've enjoyed it, and I'm certain I'll continue to enjoy it. The difference is that my students will be the ones doing the athletic work. I'm content with being the captain of the ship, sending the shore teams off to have adventures." He looked up as his wife came over and pulled a camp chair over for her so that he could put his arm around her and receive a kiss. It was clear that they enjoyed a happy and affectionate marriage. And if you've got the support of someone you love as well, Charlie, now that makes all the difference in the world. Her hand engulfed in her husband's, Mrs. Petrie smiled at Charlie. "Have you got someone that you love, Charlie?" Charlie nodded. Yes, I have." He glanced over to where Rosie stood talking with her father and two of Petrie's assistants, but somehow Victoria's face flashed into his mind's eye and his confidence faltered. Petrie noticed the shadow cross the young man's face, and his expression grew troubled, but then Charlie stood up, and the moment passed. "Thank you, sir. I'll certainly take everything that you've told me to heart, and thank you very much for all of your help." Petrie stood also, shaking Charlie's hand, fervently hoping that the young man would indeed see his way clear to recognize what was truly important in life. Charlie walked across the camp and towards his tent, still thinking about what Petrie had just told him. He saw Max coming the other way and stopped to talk as the other man caught his attention. "Can I have a quick word with you, Charlie?" Max said. Charlie was pleased to note that Max was now calling him by his first name. "What is it, Max?" "Well, it's just that, well, I don't want you to think." Max was obviously struggling to get out what he wanted to say. "Don't worry, Max. Say what you think. Just spit it out." "Well, it's about you and Miss Rosie, Charlie. I know that you have been, well, how can I say, getting on very well recently. Know what I mean? Don't you think that you should be careful with her? She's a bit of a one, she is." He paused for a moment. "What with you having a lovely girl back home and all that?" Charlie stared at Max, slightly bemused. "Are you telling me how to conduct my love life, Max?" "No, I'm just concerned that you don't get yourself into a mess, that's all." Charlie started to get annoyed. This was none of his business. "What has this got to do with you?" he said, with just a little bit more anger than he would have liked. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything." Max turned to walk away and then came back. "It's just that this happened to me once and it all turned out wrong in the end. I just didn't want you to make the same mistake, that's all. Let's just leave it at that, shall we?" Charlie realized that Max was trying to show some concern for him, so he urged him to tell more. "I'm sorry for snapping at you. I'd be happy to listen to your advice, Max." Max started to tell his tale. "Well, I met this lovely girl in Africa, see, and we had a bit of a thing going on, you know what I mean?" He winked at Charlie knowingly. "But when I got home, my girl Mary found out about it, and then she didn't want anything to do with me after that. I realized that I had made a big mistake. Mary was my real love, and I lost her over a bit of slap and tickle. That's all it was, slap and tickle, and the consequences were that I lost my girl for good. I don't want you to make the same mistake, Charlie. You think on. It's no use me telling you when it's all too late, is it?" With that, Max smiled and walked away, leaving Charlie standing alone. Charlie thought long and hard about what Petrie and Max had told him. The path he was about to travel was fraught with unknown perils, which, according to the Amduat, would lead him either to mortal danger or to ultimate self-discovery. Since leaving England, he had experienced a great deal. he now felt different about himself and about his life. He knew that he loved Victoria, but Rosie was so exciting, so sexy. He was also starting to realize that his life thus far had been very sheltered and privileged. He hoped that he would be strong enough to be able to cope during the next phase of his adventure, the journey into the underworld. It took them 2 days to prepare for their entry into the underground chambers. Max, as usual, knew exactly what to do and what to take with them. The most difficult parts of the preparation proved to be getting hold of a suitable boat, and then waterproofing their equipment so that it would be usable on the other side of the water gate. 2 boats were acquired from the local village. One was about 10 feet long, the other about 6. Both were shallow-bottomed of a type that the local riverfolk used on the Nile. Max and Charlie chose the larger of the 2 boats, and it was manhandled down to the edge of the pit. The smaller boat was left to one side at the temple. Max's sapper skills proved to be invaluable once again as they flooded the boat and weighed it down with large stones so that it would sink to the bottom of the pit. It was then dragged through the underwater tunnel with strong ropes and pulleys and into the inner chamber. Their equipment, which comprised lamps, ropes, grappling hooks, and such items, were wrapped up securely in goatskin and leather packages to keep them waterproof. A local villager showed Max how best to seal the joints and make them completely watertight. Food and water was also prepared and packed, as they did not know how long they would be underground, indeed whether they would ever emerge safely. Charlie also made sure that his rucksack containing the revolver was adequately catered for. Once they were ready to proceed, their clothing was removed and packed in watertight bags. Rosie kept on her long undergarments to protect her modesty, despite Charlie's rather cheeky whispered requests for her to strip right down to the minimum. Petrie and his staff helped them lower the sealed and waterproofed bags containing equipment down into the rank water. Charlie shook Petrie's hand and thanked him once again for his assistance, then slid down to join the equipment where it floated. Rosie was lowered next, wrinkling her nose involuntarily at the smell, but game nonetheless, and Max followed after, holding one end of the rope that was tied around the unhappy Chatsworth's chest. "Come on then, sir," Charlie called. "We'll catch you, and Max will pull you through once you've got a good breath in." Chatsworth squeezed his eyes shut and lowered himself cautiously to a chorus of good luck from the sight team, bobbing uncertainly in the water as he waited for Max to prepare for the dive. Charlie looked around and grinned. "All right then, let's go." Turning, he dived under, followed by Rosie. Max looked at Chatsworth and gave him a quick count. 1, 2, breathe in now, and dived, pulling the unfortunate engineer behind him. To the terrified Chatsworth, it seemed that the short journey to the chamber lasted forever. He was positive that he was going to run out of breath long before he could surface from the ghastly dim green stuff, but in a matter of moments he was up on the bank, gasping and shuddering, while Rosie and Charlie untied the rope. The entrance chamber was about 30 feet square, with a fine barrel-vaulted ceiling some 20 feet high at its apex. Water dripped down in places from the roof, but on the whole, it was remarkably dry in here, considering that it was so close to the water table of the Nile. Charlie could see some tide marks on the walls, indicating that the water levels in here rose from time to time, probably when the Nile flooded. Max began to unpack and arrange their equipment, including the oil lamps in the boat. Everybody else dried themselves off and got dressed quickly, as soon as they had extracted their dry clothing from the supplies. Once Chatsworth was suitably attired, he stood up and stared around at the decorated walls in amazement. Rosie took one of the lights and began to examine the hieroglyphs more closely, muttering to herself in amazement as she translated the text. The wall decorations, however, were not the only attraction. At the opposite end from where they had entered, a huge tunnel entrance gaped in the darkness, and Charlie could see that the current in the water flowed in that direction. He threw a small stick into the water to confirm his theory, and noticed that it was immediately drawn off down the tunnel. The floor of the chamber was slick and slimy. He could hear odd drips of water in the tunnels, the far-off sound magnified by the properties of the chamber. In all, this was a truly dismal place to be. He fished in one of the bags and produced a large ball of twine on a stick, which he secured by one end to a rock. "What's that?" Chatsworth asked, diverted. Charlie grinned, pleased with himself. "This is so we can find our way back if we have to. We'll tie this off here and trail it behind us from the boat, and if we need to return this way, it will guide us, like Theseus in the Minoan labyrinth." Chatsworth looked impressed. "Very clever, Charlie." He stacked the last of his group of supplies neatly in the boat and dusted off his hands. "That's the lot of it. I imagine we're ready to go." "Excellent," Charlie replied, as Rosie turned away from her examination of the walls to join him. "Max, I believe we're set." There was an odd silence as Max straightened from his work, but he said nothing, and he didn't turn around. Something about his stance was off. As Charlie stared at the ex-soldier, he realized that Max's shoulders were hunched in that odd fashion he got when he was bothered by something. Something was obviously wrong, but Charlie had no clue what it might be. "Max?" he said softly, reaching forward to touch the other man on the arm. Max whipped around unexpectedly with blinding speed, revealing a gun in his hand. "Stay where you are, Charlie!" he shouted. "All of you! Don't move!" He was shaking with some undetermined emotion. There was sadness in his eyes, but the hand holding the gun was disturbingly steady. Charlie was amazed to find that his own hands were rock still. The trembling he felt must have been internal. "What's going on, Max?" he asked, trying very hard to sound calm. Max shook his head. "You'll find out soon enough," he said bitterly, and consulted his watch. Then he looked down into the water as if expecting someone to join them. There was a sudden splashing from under the water gate as a shadowy shape slid towards them, trailing bubbles. Charlie stared in astonishment as someone, or something, swam in through the tunnel. Who could this be? The uninvited visitor promptly surfaced and then swam up to the bank. As the person heaved himself out of the water, Chatsworth thought to himself that it was Petrie, who may have joined them, but he soon realized that he had never seen the stranger before. Rosie stared at the newcomer, dumbfounded, as she had never seen him either. However, both Max and Charlie knew immediately who it was.